Thanks for checking out this horror debate series video. So, we've covered a lot of things about franchises, and now we're on to the most overrated franchise after having done the most underrated. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one, but this is part of the fun, is hearing other people's arguments to what I'm saying, or counterpoints basically to what my picks are or what Uncle Pete's picks are, and also just your opinion on what you think would be the most overrated horror franchise. So obviously how this works is I'm going to give my points on why I think that Friday the 13th is the most overrated franchise. Then you can watch your friendly neighborhood Uncle Pete's video, which is linked in the description, or his channel's linked in the description. He'll have a video of the same name, and you can get his pick, all of his reasons for it. And then if you want to be included in voting on who you think made the best points for their pick, you can come back to my channel, go to the community tab, and vote for who you think wins. Or even tie. There's even a selection for ties. So I know a lot of you are already scratching your heads and saying, why would Carlin say that Friday the 13th is the most overrated horror franchise? Part of it spawns from my first point. This franchise permeates everything in the horror community. No matter where you go, it is Friday the 13th everywhere. It is so popular and so hyped up that it cannot be avoided if you have anything to do with the horror community. Conventions, there's always Friday the 13th stuff. Any sort of store, online or in person, that has horror things, it's gonna have Friday the 13th. It is everywhere. People always talk about it. I can't tell you, I'm in some horror groups online, and I can't tell you how often Friday the 13th comes up. And in comparison, what I chose for the best franchise, in my opinion, Evil Dead, gets talked about way less, unfortunately, than Friday the 13th. Just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, of my experience with how much time people devote to talking about Friday the 13th and how much it is merchandised, because there is so much of it. If you watch my channel when I was doing a lot of unboxings, you would have seen I did a lot of horror boxes, and so often there were items from Friday the 13th. The only other franchise that got close to the amount of items from Friday the 13th were A Nightmare on Elm Street. That's probably the number two that kind of gets mentioned the most. So anyway, moving on to another point. This franchise barely has any story and feels like it's basically stuck with no evolution. If you really think about the overall story of the franchise, it doesn't really go anywhere. The whole idea is we have the events of the first one where, obviously Jason Voorhees is not the killer, it's his mother. And then it becomes Jason Voorhees as the killer in the second one. All of us say, okay, fine, whatever, we're gonna blow right past that story-wise because it's so interesting, the kills are so good, it's something new. I get that. That's totally fine. And I really enjoy the first two Friday the 13th movies. I really do. And there are other ones in the franchise that I really enjoy as well. I'll be honest, I even really enjoy Freddy vs. Jason. I'm a fan of that one. But not all of those entries are good, and the story is barely ever there. You compare it to a bunch of other franchises, probably the best franchise to compare it to say, Friday the 13th in comparison has like no story, is the Chucky franchise. Look at how much story the Chucky franchise has and where they go with things. Spanning a lot of films, spanning a TV show. Friday the 13th doesn't cover nearly as much ground, doesn't change as much, doesn't evolve as much, doesn't stay as relevant. It honestly has a very hard time staying relevant, and I would argue it never really did. It just always played off of, okay, we have this unstoppable killer, and you're going to want to see people die, and it's going to be in cool ways, and there will be good practical effects and gore. Which, I'm all for that stuff. I'm not trying to make the argument that this is a bad franchise. I enjoy the franchise. I own it on Blu-ray. Not that, big, awesome box set that I think it was Scream Factory put out. But, yeah, one day maybe. So I'm not saying that I don't like it, that it's not good. It is good. I'm just saying it's vastly overrated for what it is, for how much hype it gets, for how much it's talked about. So let's move on to my next point. It's literally the horror genre noob franchise. I know a lot of people aren't going to like this. When people scrape the surface, it is Friday the 13th and it is Nightmare on Elm Street. this is the franchise people find first in horror, basically. And I think that for that reason is why so many people talk about it, because it is the most accessible, because it's the most visible. Like I'm saying, it's everywhere. When you get into the horror community, it's like the first thing you see. So anyone starting to get into the horror community, it's like, oh, Friday the 13th is being thrown in your face. It's being recommended to you. So people are just going to go for it. And so it's one of those franchises that, since it's so early on in a lot of people's viewings, they really glom onto that, and it's kind of can become their first love as far as horror franchises go. So, like, I understand that, but I think that's also another reason why it feeds into this overrated aspect of it. Because at this point, people are taking in something that's fun, that's cool, that's a good franchise, but they haven't experienced a whole lot else. So yeah, but I know there are a lot of counterpoints to that where there are plenty of people who are like, I've seen pretty much everything there is horror-wise under the sun, and I still love it. I get that. That's totally cool. This is just my opinion, obviously. Barely any characters are interesting. There is pretty much no backstory on almost every character. Not all of them, but just about every character, because they're all fodder. And one of the things that I personally look for, and I think is more interesting and more engaging in movies, is having interesting characters, having character development. It's obvious that characters are just there as fodder. And Friday the 13th did really popularize, after Halloween, really did popularize slashers even more, and kind of took it to this level of, we're just going to have people who you don't really need to get to know. They're just going to be fodder for killing. And it turns into this whole moment of now you're rooting for the killer. In Halloween, you're not rooting for the killer. But when Friday the 13th came about, and as it goes on in this franchise, it becomes about rooting for the killer, which is pretty messed up if you think about it. Yeah, that's what it turns into. My next point. Jason Voorhees isn't that interesting of a killer. He's just written in the most lazy way possible. Now, hear me out on this. His look is interesting, but him as a villain in general, he's not interesting. His origin story, okay for the first movie. Origin story, fine for the first movie. Once you go past that, he's not developed at all. And it's this miraculous, all of a sudden, he's not a child anymore. He's this grown-up dude who came back to life because he wants to avenge his mother's death. And his mother was avenging his death. It's like this, it's lazy writing, and Jason Voorhees literally is one of the most lazy villains. I would say Michael Myers is also extremely lazy too. But and the other thing is that Jason Voorhees feels like he's bitten straight off of Michael Myers. I mean, he's literally posing off of Michael Myers. He's just like bigger, badder, more indestructible type ordeal, and has that kind of more supernatural element going on to him. But literally, in my opinion, that's lazy writing. Not having an interesting enough villain. You want to consider interesting villains? Look at the shirt I'm wearing. Phantasm 2, Tall Man, extremely interesting villain on that one. I would say the Tall Man, much better villain than Jason Voorhees, but that is also a debate for another one of these horror debate series topics, which I'm not going to say it's in the works, but it's on our list to eventually get to something like that. So yeah. Next point, Jason X is pretty bad, as are some of the other entries in the franchise. People have to admit this is not a perfect franchise. It is, overall, I would say, not even close to as good as Evil Dead. I don't want to say Nightmare on Elm Street. I have to go back and rewatch Nightmare on Elm Street. That and Friday the 13th might be kind of close. Chucky, I think, overall is a better franchise than Friday the 13th for sure, because there's a lot more story to it. There's a lot more trying in the script writing, to be honest, and there's a lot more evolution of things that are actually going on in the movie. It's less lazy. I mean, I really do think that Friday the 13th was, except for the practical effects standpoint, was a very lazy franchise. Practical effects, they really worked hard on that, and for that I do enjoy it, but yeah. And then my last point. It's the most popular franchise, but it is certainly not the best franchise. Therefore, it is overrated. Because for how much it's seen and talked about and hyped up, and it's not perfect, and you can point to a bunch of franchises that are better than it, that just proves that it is overrated for what it is, even though it is still a good franchise. Just saying. Those are my points. That's what I want to leave you with. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much, but that's kind of, we kind of get into that with these videos because it's a little more, even though I have points written down, it is a little more off the cuff, off the top of my head type stuff. But this is where I would love to hear your thoughts, especially if you're a Friday the 13th fan. Let me know why you think that the franchise is not overrated. I'm very interested to hear that stuff. And also just, what do you think is the most overrated franchise? And also, if you didn't comment on the most underrated video, you can comment on that here too. What's the most underrated franchise? So go ahead and put comments down there. Or we can also just talk horror in general. If you want to talk about something else, that's totally fine. On any of my videos, honestly, because I'm always down to just talk about horror. So do me a favor, hit subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I would greatly appreciate that. Also, hit the notification bell button if you want to know when I'm putting up new videos, which I'm doing 3 a week at this point. But thank you so much for taking your time to watch this. I really appreciate it. Make sure you check out Uncle Pete's video and comment on his, like and subscribe to both our channels. Support both of us. We really do enjoy that because we're putting in a lot of hard work. But thank you so much, and until next time, keep it brutal.